Do you want to hear a story? Once upon a time, there was a Palestinian architect who was a very talented architect in the beginning of the 1900s, and he built houses all over Palestine, most of which are still standing until today. In 1934, he decided to design and build his own house for his family. And he did, and then he moved into that house with his wife and his 3 children at the time. In 1947, a group of armed people came into this house and at gunpoint told this family that they had 24 hours to get out of the house or the house would be blown up with them in it. So they had no choice, they had to leave. And do you know where they moved? They moved right across the street from this house. Why? Because these people that came in had decided to create an invisible line in Jerusalem, separating the west of Jerusalem from the east of Jerusalem. And at that point, those mobs and those terrorists took that side, the western side of Jerusalem, and called it Israel. And the eastern side of Jerusalem continued to be Palestine. Now, this architect's house happened to be on the exact street of that invisible line. So when they moved across the street, literally across the street from their old house, the story goes, because I've heard this is my husband's grandfather, so I've heard this story from my mother-in-law, and I've heard it from other family members and from my father-in-law in a video that I watched, a documentary. And they said that every single day, their dad, my husband's grandfather, would go up to the roof to look at his house because they had started building the wall. Not the wall that we have now, but a wall separating the two. So he would stand on the roof to look at his own house, brokenhearted. Now, in the following few years, they moved around Palestine. They moved to Beit Hanina, moved to Al Bire, and eventually settled down in Ramallah. And then the war in 1967 broke out. And my husband's grandfather decided to rush to Jerusalem. Why? Because he knew that if he's in Jerusalem, when they do the counting, he will be counted as an Israeli and he will get an official Israeli ID. And once he got that, he thought he would be then eligible to get his home back. Very logical thinking, makes a lot of sense. So he moved and stayed with one of his sons who was living in Jerusalem at the time. Once the dust settled from the war, the 1967 war, he went with his title deed and all of his documents to the land department. Now, at the land department, he told them, "This is my home. I was kicked out of that house. Here's the title deed. Here's my Israeli ID that you guys gave me. I want my home back." And the guy looks at him and he says, "No, this is not your home because you are absent." Ghaib in Arabic. Said, now my husband's family are very, very tall and big men. So he said, I am 190 centimeters tall. I'm standing right in front of you. How can you say that I'm absent? And he said, "How can I be absent when I'm standing right in front of you?" And the guy said, "That's what we see here in our records. You're absent and you can't get this house back."
وأول ما انحصر في القدس وصار انتهى الإحصاء راح على حارس أملاك الغائب، فراح قال لهم أنا أنضوني برامكي وهي كشان الأرض والدار وصارت القدس واحدة وإحنا بدنا نرجع للبيت، البيت فاضي. قالوا له لا أنت غايب، يعني أنت غايب. رجال كبير طويل عريض طوله 185 سم يمكن وكبير، تقول له أنت غايب. قال لهم أنا أنظر برامكي هاي قالوا له لا أنت مش موجود.
Now, this was in 1967. 5 years later, in 1972, this man died without having gotten his home back or had the chance to go inside it ever again. Now, the story goes on that many years later, the Israelis decided to turn this beautiful home into a museum, and they called it Museum on the Seam, Baramki Home, and then something along the lines of Museum for Peace. How ironic, Museum for Peace, when it was taken with violence. So one day, my father-in-law and my mother-in-law decided to go and see this museum because my father-in-law wanted to visit his home. So they walked in, and there was a guy at the door who was selling tickets to go in. And my father-in-law said, "I'm not paying to go into this house. This is my home." And they let him in because, you know, they really care about peace and everything. Now, my husband's grandfather is a Christian. One of the prominent families, Christian families in Palestine. The records, like the dates that they were able to get to through the church records, goes back to the 1700s. And when they lived in their home in Jerusalem before these terrorists came into our country, they lived happily and comfortably next to their Muslim neighbors, Christian neighbors, and Jewish neighbors. Now, this story is one of so many similar stories in Palestine, of people who lived and died and weren't able to go back into their homes. And these people, for them, home is different, especially for someone like the story that I'm telling you about. He was an architect. He knew every single stone, and he used red stone to build this home. He knew every corner. He designed it with his heart. And many other people felt the same way. This is still ongoing for thousands and tens of thousands of Palestinians. I guess the reason I'm telling you this story is because I think we need to continue to talk about these stories. First, to remind everyone that obviously none of this started on October 7th, but it's been going on for decades, and the pain has gone on for, I think, for long enough by now. There's a documentary, Al Jazeera documentary, on YouTube that you can watch. It's in Arabic, and there's an interview with my father-in-law and 4 other people who have very similar stories, where they talk about how their parents were forced out of their homes and how they never got to go back to their homes. And for most of them, there are settlers living in these homes now. For us, it's a museum. And the heartbreak is real. So next time someone says, "But October 7th, please remind them that none of this started on October 7th. Free Palestine.